Good evening, everyone. My name is Dennis McKnight. I'm filling in for the library director, Jennifer. I'm on the foundation board. Before I introduce our speaker, I did want to let you know that there's been a change. I want to make sure everybody knows. Next Wednesday is the roundtable discussion. The week after that, that's on global famine. The week after that, economic warfare roundtable discussion. And then this is add-on that is not in your brochure, but remember we had the ice storm a few weeks ago? Okay, this is John Katzka is going to speak the following Wednesday, which will be the 29th, again at our normal 6:30, so that's been rescheduled. So that's the reason it's not in the brochure, because of the storm. And as Beth just said, it's a good thing we didn't schedule this for tomorrow night. Yeah. So with that, let me also say that Sam back there in the room is filming this. And for the people that did view the February 8th presentation, which was Richard Rockamora on China, we have that online, and believe it or not, Jennifer told me that we've had 51 people have watched this online already. So they are available online, and Sam back there is a guy that can tell you how to access it. So if you can't find it, call the library, they will tell you. So want to make you aware of that. Finally, let me say that this presentation is put on by the Franklin Public Library Foundation, Jerome J. and Dorothy Holtz Family Foundation, and Carol and Tom Donovan as sponsors. And Carol and Tom actually are here tonight, so why don't you raise your hands? Yeah, Carol. I also just walked in the room. I just want to point this fellow out, but Dave Adam used to serve on the library board with me. And Dave, and I told Beth, you might want to call on this guy because he's been to Iran. So, special. Okay, Beth Dougherty is manager, professor of international relations and political science, Department of Beloit College. She has spoken with us, how many years? 4, 5? A lot, okay. And she does an excellent job. I hear about whether it's good or bad from everybody, and I'm telling you, between Paulo and her, we get the best comments. So they're excellent. They're from Beloit College, and we've got a very interesting topic tonight, Iran at a crossroads. So please enjoy. Hold your questions to the end. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, yeah, oh good, I can hear the mic, everyone can hear me, yeah? Sure. Great. Well, thank you all for inviting me again to come up this year. I really enjoy doing these library presentations. Oftentimes give me a chance to delve into a subject that I'm not teaching in any of my classes, which the Iranian domestic politics would be one of those things. It's very serendipitous that this talk was scheduled for today, March 8th, because today is actually International Women's Day, and the theme for the United Nations this year is gender equality today for a sustainable tomorrow. And so they're talking about the younger generation as generation equality in the hopes that gender equity will move further than it already has. And that is especially relevant in light of what I want to talk about tonight, which is the protest movement, which has been moving through Iran. I just realized I left my notes over on the, Sam, could you hand me that? Might want to have those. Thank you. Oh, thanks. Okay. Yes. So, want to talk about the Iranian protest movement. In particular, the Woman Life Freedom protests, which started in September of 2022, right? And really, these have kind of raised the question of what Iran's future is going to be. And so what I'd like to do tonight is, first of all, give you a brief overview of the political and security structures of the Islamic Republic. And then I want to talk about a series of interconnected crises that the regime is facing that are threatening its very survival. It's already lost its legitimacy in the eyes of its own population. The most recent rounds of protests in Iran are aimed not just at the hardliners, but at the reformist factions as well for the first time. People are angry that the reformists have been unable to fulfill the promises that they have made. And because of the spread of the protests, this really leaves the regime with little except repression and violence as its only option to stay in power. In earlier iterations of movements in Iran, there was the possibility of reform, but that has now been closed down. Not only is it clear that the hardliners in the government themselves are not open to reform, but the population has moved beyond that, right? And I can show you what some of the slogans have been that they've been chanting at these protests. In many ways, this is reminiscent of what happened during the protests against the Shah's regime in the late 1970s. Because there was a certain point at which those protests passed the point of no return. They went from calling for a constitutional monarchy, basically just respect for human rights, reform the Shah's regime, to death to the Shah. And we have passed that tipping point now with the Islamic Republic. So the four areas that I want to look at in terms of these interlocking crises would be demography, political grievances on the part of the Iranian population, socioeconomic grievances, and then grievances related to environmental problems and climate change. As many of you are no doubt aware, the Iranian regime is an Islamic republic. It was established in 1979 after the overthrow of the Shah. It has a kind of complicated government system. You can see here the blue offices are ones that are appointed, and the green offices are the ones that are elected. So there are elections that are held in Iran. Depending on the particular election and year you're talking about, there are more or less restrictions. None of them, I would say, are ever completely free and fair, but there are some elements of democratic systems that you see operating in Iran. The problem is the parliament and the president, which are both popularly elected, are completely outweighed by the appointed side of this structure. And at the top of the entire system, you have the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And the supreme leader is just that, supreme. Everything in the government structure ultimately reports back to Khamenei. His word is the last word on anything. Ayatollah Khamenei, though, is elderly. He's in bad health. The likelihood is that we're facing some kind of transition in Iran, over the next several years. There is some talk that they would like to make his son supreme leader when Ayatollah Khamenei passes from the scene. But there's also a fair amount of speculation that it will be the current president, Ibrahim Raisi, who will become the supreme leader after Khamenei. Raisi actually ran for president in 2017 in Iran. He lost that election, right, to President Rouhani, only received about 38.5% of the vote, right? But he has since been reelected. He is a hardliner. He is known as one of the 4 or 5 individuals that were responsible for the handing out of literally thousands of death sentences against dissidents in Iran in the 1990s. So he's been called the hanging judge. He also is the deputy chair of the Assembly of Experts, which is the body that is charged with picking the supreme leader after the supreme leader dies. So he's in a very powerful position. You can also see Raisi is still fairly a young person. What we've seen politically in Iran over the last several decades has been a cycle in which you have had hardliners come into power, followed by reformists. So Mohammad Khatami and Hassan Rouhani are both in the reformist camp, interspersed with right-wing populist governments such as Ahmadinejad and then also currently President Raisi. But the most recent elections in Iran for president saw the lowest turnout since 1979. The most recent Majlis parliamentary elections also were the lowest parliamentary outcome since 1979. And people are reading the lack of participation as a clear sign of the depth of people's dissatisfaction with the Iranian political system. And one of the reasons for that is in order to run for office in the Islamic Republic, you need to be approved by the Guardian Council. And the Guardian Council has repeatedly disqualified large numbers of candidates. So in the most recent parliamentary elections, they disqualified 9,000 out of the 16,000 names that had been put forward. In the 2021 presidential elections, they only approved 7 candidates. 3 of those candidates withdrew a couple of days before the election started, and the remaining candidates were being harassed by the regime, so setting it up to ensure that Raisi would be able to win, which he did with 62% of the vote. So it's clear that even just from looking at things like political participation, that there is a lot of dissatisfaction and anger in the Iranian electorate. On the security side, you have a bifurcated system in Iran because it has a regular military, right, a regular set of armed services, Army, Navy, Air Force, but it also has a parallel system of revolutionary security services. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which actually has a larger budget than does the regular Iranian army. Within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, you have the Basij, which is a paramilitary, and then you also have police forces, which included, until recently, the morality police, the so-called guardian or guidance patrol, rather. You have compulsory conscription for all healthy men in Iran who are over the ages of 19 years old to do 2 years of military service. It's about 400,000 conscripts a year are going in, and maybe 50,000 of that 400,000 will be recruited into the Revolutionary Guard Corps. They have about 125 men under arms. They report directly to the Supreme Leader. They are more powerful than the regular army. They have a higher budget than the regular army. And it includes the Quds Force, which is its overseas paramilitary arm, which is operating, for example, in Iraq and in Syria. The IRGC has its own naval and air units, its own intelligence forces, its own counterintelligence forces, its own security arms, and it oversees Iran's ballistic missile program. It's heavily linked to Iran's extraterritorial repression. So Iran has started in recent years to attempt to reach beyond its own borders to repress dissidents and others who are speaking up against the Islamic regime. It was linked in 2022 to at least 10 separate kidnapping and assassination plots that were foiled in the UK. Its purpose is to defend the revolutionary regime. So the army's purpose is to protect Iran from external attack, but the IRGC is specifically tasked with protecting the revolutionary regime. So it is very tightly tied in with the Ayatollah Khomeini. It is deeply entangled in the economy in Iran. We see this in a number of Middle Eastern states where the militaries actually begin to have a vast business and commercial enterprise. Ironically, the IRGC's business empire has expanded because of US sanctions. The maximum pressure campaign that was placed on the Iranians by the Trump administration, and then just US sanctions in general, which of course there is an enormous number of sanctions that have been on Iran since 1979 for all kinds of different reasons. But basically what this has meant is Iran has set up a lot of businesses to try to circumvent sanctions, Well, who runs the businesses that are smuggling around the sanctions? The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So one report said that in the last several years, of the 14 private sector construction companies, 13 of them went bankrupt. All the rest of those contracts have gone to the construction arm for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So construction, telecommunications, oil and gas, and transportation are the main areas where the IRGC is operating. So I want to turn my attention to the crises of legitimacy that the regime is facing. And again, I want to look at demography, politics, socioeconomic situation, and then environmental crises. So the demographic issue for Iran, it's kind of in a transition phase right now. So it can be described both as being very young, but also with an aging population, right? And there are concerns about that aspect of it. But after the Islamic Republic was established, they instituted some very effective policies to rein in population growth, okay? Because when the Islamic Republic came in, the population growth rate was at about 4%. So that averaged out to about 6.5 children per woman in the mid-1980s. And so the population was growing far too quickly, and the regime, again, put into place this very highly regarded and actually oftentimes copied population control program. They brought the fertility rate down enormously, so that the current fertility rate in Iran is about 1.7 children per woman. However, the replacement rate, right, for a population is 2.1 children per woman. And so Iran has been under the replacement rate since at least 2010, and there is no sign that that population is going to go up. So the concern is, on one hand, that by 2050, Iran will be the oldest country in the Middle East. The percentage of its population over 60 years old at that point will be approximately 30%. And recognizing that it's got an aging population moving forward, which is a burden on the economy because many of these people will require pension payments, et cetera, right? And the regime, of course, is under heavy economic stress. So they have been desperately trying in the last 10 or 12 years to reverse their population control policies to absolutely no avail. Instead, the current problem that the Iranians face in terms of their demography is that almost 47% of their population is under the age of 30 years old. And of course, with that brings you need to educate this population, you need to find jobs for this population, et cetera. But critically, anybody who's under the age of 45 was basically born after the Islamic Republic was founded. This is a generation that has no memory of the Shah's regime. They have no stake in the Islamic Republic. It is a generation that is far more connected to the outside thanks to the internet and to social media. And it has become the generation that is pushing the protest movement in Iran. So the regime itself has estimated that the vast majority of the protesters who have come out into the streets in 2022, 2023 are actually under the age of 25. And the younger generation, Gen Z in Iran, they want jobs, they want more political freedom, they want more freedom in general, they want an end to the morality police telling women how they should be allowed to dress, etc. And so this is a younger generation, again, that does not have the same frame of reference for why you would want an Islamic Republic that earlier generations did. And so in many ways, it is not surprising that the current regime has completely lost legitimacy, especially with this younger demographic. And again, speaking about today, the older population is in the future, but today, almost 50% of this population is under the age of 30. The second major grievance that the Iranian population has, of course, is political repression. Iran has one of the worst human rights records of any country in the world. And of course, the human rights issues are on top of what many people see as the rigged nature of their political system, right? The fact that the Guardian Council repeatedly has intervened to disqualify candidates, right? They manipulated election results in 2009, which I'll come back to in a minute. The notion that the entire political system is built around literally the say of one person, right? What Ayatollah Khamenei says is that is the only thing that matters in the Iranian political system. Unfortunately, there is endemic corruption, and for many people in Iran, they would say incompetence in many levels of their own government. As far as the human rights record for Iran, we've seen severe restrictions on media and heavy censorship. The hardliners control the state broadcasting company. Satellite dishes are banned, although many people have satellite dishes periodically. There will be these campaigns where they go around and confiscate people's satellite dishes, but nonetheless, theoretically, they are supposed to be illegal. The regime has used excessive force to crush protest movements. There are no labor unions that are permitted, and labor conditions are oftentimes quite bad for individuals. Human rights activists and organizations, when they are able to operate, are harassed. They are frequently jailed. They are tortured. The judiciary is used as a way to silence the opposition, and it can do this through the use of vague laws, through show trials, long sentences, holding people under arrest without trial or charge. Prison conditions in Iran are dreadful, especially in Evin prison in Tehran, which is where the majority of the human rights activists and young people that have been recently erected are there. The complaints include a lack of medical care, and here we're talking like deliberate withholding of medical care, overcrowding, ill treatment, and torture. Iran is second only to China in the number of executions that it carries out. Minority regions are marginalized and discriminated against. So the majority of the population in Iran is Persian, but you have significant Azeri, Kurdish, Arab, and Baluch populations. And I have a map later on. You can see that actually geographically and not just politically, they are on the periphery of the Iranian state. And then, of course, you have for the issue of women, where saying that women do not have equal rights in Iran is a complete understatement, right? They are second-class citizens. They need permission to travel abroad from a husband or from a father, and there's the guidance patrol telling women, you don't have enough of your hair covered, they don't like what you're wearing, etc. So the political repression, in some ways, it has allowed the regime to stay in power, but it is rapidly reaching a point at which this is now boomeranging in the other direction, and it is driving people out into the streets. Iran's second major issue is a lot of socioeconomic problems. Part of this is related, of course, to sanctions, because Iran is the world's most sanctioned country until the Russians invaded Ukraine. There have been a raft of sanctions that have been passed on, the additional sanctions that have been put on Iran just in the last couple of days. Again, part of them to coincide with International Women's Day because of the repression of the protests that have been going on for the last several months. There are human rights sanctions, there are ballistic missile program sanctions, there are meddling in its neighbors sanctions, and then there are sanctions related to its nuclear program, right? And so lifting one set of sanctions doesn't necessarily mean all sanctions go away, and it's the United States, the European Union, and the United Nations. So you have multiple layers of sanctions. At this point, when you talk about putting new sanctions on the Iranians, largely what you're talking about, because it is already so heavily sanctioned, are targeted sanctions on individuals, right? So the individuals that are running The jails that have most recently been identified as torture sites, those individuals went on to the US sanctions list in the last couple of weeks. It means things like their bank accounts are frozen overseas, they can't travel, oftentimes it means their family members can't travel, etc. So trying to turn the screws on the perpetrators themselves, right? And not just punishing the entire Iranian population. Sanctions are not the only issue, though, for the Iranian economy. As I said, you have corruption. There's a lot of nepotism and cronyism that goes on, mismanagement of various aspects of the economy. And this has pushed large numbers of Iranians into a position of economic precarity in the last number of years. Right? And even in those years where you have had economic growth in Iran, which here would be represented in the blue bars at the top. It's when they've had positive GDP growth. The red, obviously, or when they've had negative GDP growth. Even when there have been positive growth numbers, those benefits have not been inclusive. Right? They have mainly benefited the state and the elite. So the people around Ayatollah Khamenei, and Khamenei himself apparently is worth tens of billions of dollars personally. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps would be another. And this has led to massive inequality within the Iran between the sort of the elite and everybody else. Over the last several years, what has really been plaguing for many Iranians has been a high inflation rate, which has been especially felt in prices of staples such as eggs, onions, and tomatoes, which are cornerstones of Iranian cooking. The price of those things have gone up approximately 50%. In fact, the inflation rate overall, is the one at the top, has been running at close to 50%. The currency, which is the bottom chart, has been tanking against the dollar. You have high levels of unemployment, and especially high levels of unemployment amongst three critical groups: young people, women, and the ethnic minorities. So the unemployment rate, and these are government figures, so the likelihood is the figures are much higher, that young professionals, so these are university educated individuals, their unemployment rate is at least 15%, and it was rated at about 20% at the end of 2022 for those in the category of the 15 to 24-year-olds. Iran has one of the highest unemployment rates for university graduates of any country in the world. And of course, that creates a lot of frustration and anger on the part of young people who feel like they have the skills to be able to get good jobs, but there are no jobs for them to get. There are no labor protections in Iran. As I said, labor unions are illegal, and about 50% of the workforce is in irregular employment, which means oftentimes they are not paid on time, and there's little protection from the exploitation of their employers. So workers have been one of the groups that has been persistently protesting in Iran over the last number of years. So in general, around the economy, there is tremendous anger at the failure of the regime to live up to the promises that it has given to the Iranian population. And then the other interlocking crisis with all of this, and this really plays in heavily to socioeconomic problems, is environmental issues in Iran. Some of it is driven by climate change, but a lot of it is also being driven by the overuse and mismanagement of Iran's water resources, which have contributed to desertification. Desertification in terms means that you have sandstorms that are, basically picking up the soil that is on top of these, what that was once a lake, and then sweeps that into the cities, causes all sorts of respiratory illnesses. There have been protests around the recurring sandstorms in some of the areas in Iran. Part of this has to do with the fact that Iran has built way too many dams and has built them in the wrong locations. So the map with the yellow background, the little triangles on there are dams, right? So only Russia and China have more dams than the Iranians do. But what this has meant is it has led to the drying up of wetlands and to lakes. So Lake Armia, which this is sort of the precursor to what potentially could happen to the Great Salt Lake, right? So it actually has been coming back a little bit because there have been some heavy rains in that area in the last several years, but the concern is that it's just going to slide backwards again. If it stops raining, then the water level is going to retreat back to these earlier places where it was. In some other places, like in Tehran, for example, air pollution is the major problem because there are too many cars. In Khuzestan province, you have issues also related to air pollution. And then the climate change piece of this, which just is exacerbated by bad management of water resources, is drought. And so the darker the color, the more extreme the water shortage was in Iran. So this is from showing the drought in 2021. The smaller map shows where the minority populations are located. So in the top on that side, you have Azeris and Kurds. A little further down, you have Khuzestan, which is where the Arab population is located. And then when you come over to this side, you're talking about the Beloit population. But you can see that some of those areas are in places where you have had the most severe levels of drought. This also shows some of the places where we've seen water protests, and of course those have spread since December of 2021. So these interconnected crises have led to a series of outbreaks of protests against the regime. The 2009 Green Movement was suppressed, right? And then things were relatively quiet, but in 2016, 2017, suddenly you began to see more sustained waves of protest, including the one that most recently started in September of 2022. So what I want to do is give you a quick overview of the Green Movement from 2009, and then walk you through the way in which protests have been emerging in Iran, because it tells a particular story about where Iran is headed. So some of you may remember the protests in Iran during the Green Movement. This was around the June 2009 election when Ahmadinejad was running for a second term. The Guardian Council decided to allow Mir Hussein Mousavi to run against Ahmadinejad. He had been a prime minister in the 1980s, but had been out of politics for a long time. He's not a very charismatic person, and they did not think he posed any threat whatsoever to Ahmadinejad, and so they allowed him to run in the presidential elections. What they were not prepared for was how popular Mousavi's candidacy was, and the opinion polls in the hours leading up to the election showed that he was most likely going to win that election. On June 12th, they announced the results. The government announced the results 2 hours after the polls had closed. They announced that Ahmadinejad had won 63% of the vote, and that Mousavi had only won 34%. Mousavi and the other candidates did not even win majorities in the places where they are from, right? And so immediately there was a huge outcry that there had been fraud. Mousavi came out and asked Ayatollah Khomeini to intervene. He claimed he had won the election by a large margin, and this precipitated absolutely massive demonstrations in Tehran. These were the largest demonstrations that we had seen since the actual overthrow of the Shah in 1979. On June 15th, 3 days after the results were announced, you had approximately 3 million people who demonstrated in Tehran. The slogan for the 2009 movement was, where is my vote, right? So this was definitely focused around issues of political accountability and political reform. There were massive demonstrations every day for a week, although they were predominantly in Tehran and some of the larger cities. And then for approximately 6 months, on major holidays, for example, the protest movement would come out again and bring hundreds of thousands of people out into the streets. The government, not surprisingly, cracked down very hard on the Green Movement. In fact, a sniper killed a young woman on camera on June 20th during demonstrations in Tehran. And eventually, the repression that the regime was showing, they began to use live ammunition again against protesters in late December of 2010. The 1-year anniversary of was coming up in February, and they planned, this was the anniversary of the revolution, but this was a 1 year since they had kind of begun the campaign against the current regime. There were clear plans that they were going to bring large numbers of people out into the streets in Tehran, but there was a massive crackdown in advance by the regime, which caused the leaders of the Green Movement to call the protests off. They detained thousands of people. The regime admits that approximately 36 people were killed. The opposition says that the numbers are twice that. The top leaders and activists associated with the Green Movement were all arrested and put on trial. Mir Hussein Mousavi, another one of the candidates, and their wife were all placed in house arrest in February of 2011. They all remain under house arrest today. There was a major media crackdown. The government shut the internet down for 10 solid days. They made major arrests of journalists. And in the aftermath of the 2009 Green Movement, the Revolutionary Guard Corps became the majority owner of the major Iranian telecommunications company. So the Green Movement basically was centered around calls for accountability and reform, right? They were not calling for the system to be overthrown. They were asking for the results of the election to be respected. You had identifiable leaders in 2009 who were the political candidate for president, and they were public figures, so you knew who to arrest if you wanted to sort of decapitate the protest movement. These were extremely large demonstrations, again, but they were mainly focused in Tehran and provincial capitals. They were centered on the middle class. That is basically who came out for these protests, were urban middle class individuals. And then one final thing I would say about the 2009 movement was only 1 million Iranians at that point had smartphones, right? And Twitter was only 3 years old at the time that this happened. So it's on the cusp of the sort of social media age, but Iran is not quite there yet. That is going to change, obviously, moving forward. The suppression of the Green Movement fought the regime many years of largely quiet on the political front. But we started to see a number of key protest locations over the last several years, and so I just wanted to give you a sense on the map. These are largely provincial capitals. Tehran, of course, is the capital. Mashhad is the second largest city in Iran. It's generally considered to be a conservative city, so like the social base of the support for the regime. Zahedan is in the Beloit area, Avaz is in the Arab area, and then to the north, Saqqez is in the Kurdish area, all right? And so all of these cities have been major, you've seen major outbreaks of protests in recent years. One thing I do want to note before I start, so this chart shows protests and other forms of demonstrations in Iran from the middle of 2017 to the middle of June of 2018. And it has a number of categories, so by ethnic and religious groups, by farmers, by students, and labor groups. Those are the main colors that are on that. But you can see that there have been large numbers of protests. Oftentimes these are very small, but I mention this simply because in the aftermath of the Tahrir Square uprising that overthrew Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, when we looked back, of course, everyone was surprised and shocked that the regime collapsed in 17 days, but when we looked back at what had been happening in Egypt, it had been clear that for several years prior to that, you had large-scale protest movements happening all over the country, right, but at a low level, mainly workers. But one thing that this does is give people the experience of coming out. It helps them form networks, which they can then use to build larger social movements going forward. And so the pressure has been building in Iran for a little while. So in December of 2017, you had what are called the day protests. They were sparked by a very sudden 50% rise in the price of eggs over the space of a week. And this was following a year in which overall prices had risen by about 50%. The day protests were nationwide. All right, again, unlike the Green Movement, which was heavily focused in urban areas, these protests took place in a lot of different areas. So you can see on the map everywhere there's a dot, that's an area where there was a protest. On this one, it shows kind of the different ways in which protests can play out. So yellow is any place where there was violence on the part of the regime against protesters. Orange is places where protesters were killed, or rather arrested. Red is where they died, right? And then it also indicates in gray places where people attacked the police, right? Which, again, they had not seen this in Iran before this particular set of protests. So the day protests last approximately a week, late December of 2017 into early January of 2018. There were about 70 to 100 cities and provincial towns. The rapid diffusion of these protests was made possible by Telegram, which the vast majority of Iranians have access to this app. They started in Mashhad, the second largest city, but again, this is an area that is expected to be a support base for the regime. So the regime paid close attention to what happened here. The slogans that were chanted during the day protests were much more radical than the ones that we had seen in 2009. They were calling for the overthrow of the entire regime, right? They were calling for economic justice. The 2009 protests were very narrowly focused on voting rights. And they were linking Iran's regional policy, so its involvement in places like Yemen and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, to the domestic shortcomings of the government, right? Which, again, this was unusual. The social base for these protests was largely the alienated lower socioeconomic classes. So young people, pensioners, people that were dependent on fixed incomes, and the lower middle class were largely the individuals that were involved in these protests. The protests ranged tremendously in size. So in some cases, it might be hundreds of people who came out in a place. In other places, it would be thousands, right? All told, there were tens of thousands of people that were involved in this week-long or so spasm of protests running into early 2018. The regime, again, cracked down quite brutally. At least 21 people were killed. About 5,000 individuals were detained. And in April of 2018, the government banned the Telegram app, which at that time was used by about 40 million Americans, or Iranians. The protests really did die down because of the amount of repression. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps was called out and was sent to several cities, and that seemed to have a chilling effect on the protesters. The other issue was, so the lower middle class went out in these protests, but the regular middle class, the urban middle class, did not. And there are a couple of possible reasons why the middle class split in this way. One is that the upper middle class were concerned about destabilization. The regime kept hammering on the idea that if the protests were allowed to continue, that they could turn into Syria, right? And so people may have feared the destabilization that would attend something like that, but also the reprisals, because people remembered having been arrested, detained, tortured, etc. after 2009. And so the day protests are contained after approximately a week. At around the same time that these protests will break out, you have the beginnings of the emergence of public disobedience against the hijab rules for women. In late December 2017, Vida Mubahed became the first woman who was known to publicly remove her headscarf in a public place in a protest against compulsory hijab in Iran. People began to post pictures of themselves. I mean, largely these would be individuals that would go someplace public and take off their hijab and then stand there. Sometimes they were able to walk away, but many of them ended up being arrested. This photo is of Nasreen Sotoudeh, who's a very prominent Iranian human rights lawyer. Sotoudeh was the individual who defended many of the several dozen women who were arrested and prosecuted for hijab offenses as a result of these kinds of protests. I would note that recently she and her husband were involved in a campaign to pressure the government to release a human rights activist who was on a hunger strike. That individual was in fact released, and then the Iranian regime said that they were going to insist that her husband, who had a suspended prison sentence, was going to have to go to jail, right? And most people saw this as a clear retaliatory act against them. In fact, many of the more prominent women human rights defenders in Iran are currently in prison. In November of 2019, we had another separate wave of protests. They started on November 15th, and again, it was related to inflation. You had a surprise tripling of the price of fuel. These protests were much larger than the day protests had. They spread again to about 100 cities and towns as before. They lasted approximately 10 days, give or take a few days on either side, and there was a ferocious crackdown. So earlier crackdowns against waves of protests, you have dozens of people that are killed. In the November 2019 protests, at least 321 people were killed. That's a figure that's been documented by human rights organizations. The opposition in Iran claims 1,500 people may have been killed. The government shut the internet down nationally again for a week, and thousands of people were arrested, right? They were again able to suppress this wave of protests with a heavy use of violence. In 2021, we see water protests spread for the first time. So in areas where, like Khuzestan, where there have been serious issues for water, you've had protests over the last several years. But in July of 2021, the Khuzestan protests for the first time spread elsewhere in Iran. And you had protests in other parts of the country in support of the people that were protesting in Khuzestan. This time, the government instituted a partial internet blackout. What they realized was it was very bad for the economy to just shut the internet down across the board. They've gotten much more sophisticated about it, so they could shut down particular areas of the country, like a particular city, until the protests died down, and then they could let the internet come back up again. There are some really awesome websites that you can follow this on, which literally can show you across any given 24-hour period in any place in Iran like, there's nothing, and then suddenly it's back up to 100%. So you can see how the government was engaging in this. In the Khuzestan protests, at least 8 people were killed. Again, a lot of use of water cannons, tear gas, birdshot, live ammunition against the protesters. The water protests are being driven by the mass deaths of livestock due to thirst, the drying up of rivers and wetlands, and the fact that in some of these areas you have whole villages which have been left without running water. Water protests have not been only in the Khuzestan province. This is in Isfahan, in the center of the country. These are farmers, and they are protesting in a dry riverbed. So these kinds of protests are happening quite frequently in a number of different areas across Iran. And that brings me to the most recent wave of protests. On September 13th of 2022, Mahsa Amina was arrested by the morality police because too much of her hair was showing and she was wearing skinny jeans. 3 days later, she died in the hospital, and her family said it was the result of head injuries she had received when she was beaten by the Guardian police. Amina's death touched off an explosion of anger across all major cities and many small towns in Iran. And we have seen protests, strikes, shop closures, etc., all over the country. One of the things that is remarkable about this is Mahsa Amina does not seem like the person that would have been the straw that broke the camel's back. Iran is a predominantly Shia country. It is a majority Persian, ethnically speaking, and Amina was a Sunni Kurd, so a double minority. But her death resonated across all lines in Iran in ways that none of the earlier protests have been able to transcend. So her death was able to bring people out across ethnic and class lines, across sectarian lines, and across the urban-rural divide, which had previously prevented the protests from spreading elsewhere. The 2022-2023 protests have been happening over a wider area geographically than earlier protests. They are more similar to the day protests and the 2019 protests than the Green movement, in the sense that while they're more widespread, they're happening in more places, they do tend to be small and sometimes sporadic. So again, sometimes you're going to get several dozen people that will come out and protest for 15 minutes and then they will disperse. In other places, though, you are talking about thousands of people that are coming out and protesting for longer periods of time. 2009, the protests were extremely large. They were organized, they were longer, but they weren't daily. This has been going on, went on for months, actually, on a daily basis. These protests have been more sustained than the 2 earlier waves in 2017, 2018, and 2019, which both were only able to last a week or two. These went on at quite a high level of intensity from September all the way through to the end of 2022. These are leaderless protests. So there's, unlike 2009 when you knew who the people were that were organizing it, most of these protests are being organized on social media, and they're being organized amongst friend groups, right? This is similar to what happened in a lot of the Arab Spring protests. In 2009, there were only 28 million Iranians that were online. In 2022, it's about 72 million people, right? So the vast majority of the population has access to the internet. In these protests, young people are predominant, so it's mainly under 25. Some estimates say it's as high as 95% of them are young people. And then the other really striking feature of these protests is they are being led by women, and oftentimes by young women. So girls in their classrooms taking off their hijabs. There was a video that circulated in October of a group of young girls chasing an Iranian Revolutionary Guard official out of the courtyard of their school while they're chanting shame at him. And at first he's facing them and trying to get them to quiet down, and then realizes there are a lot of them, and he turns around and he leaves. So you have women that are leading these protests, which have not happened before, and you've got men that are coming out in support of them. So you've got that kind of unity that is happening. And this is where the slogan for these protests that has come, which here you can see it in both Kurdish and Persian, but basically it translates to woman, life, freedom. In Shia Islam, oftentimes on the 40th day after someone dies, there are additional commemorations. They use this to great effect in the Islamic protests against the Shah of Iran. And so October 26th was 40 days since Mahsa Amini's death. There were massive protests that took place throughout Iran. The regime, as is typical, has cracked down very heavily. Been hundreds of people killed, 20,000 people at least have been arrested. At least 100 people are facing death sentences for their participation in these protests. But what the regime ultimately did that brought the protests under control was they executed 4 young men. 2 of them were executed in December. 2 of them were executed in January. And the first of the protesters to be killed, after he was hung, his body was publicly displayed hanging off the edge of a crane in Tehran. Those executions seemed to kind of, again, put a layer of, dampened the protests down, but did not dampen the defiance of many of the people that were involved here. And so there were protests on the 40th day after the January executions. That would have been on February 17th. And these are pictures from the protest that was taking place in Zahedan over here in the Beloit area. It's very hard, of course, to get good information about what's happening in Iran because the regime has been arresting journalists that have been reporting on these. There aren't international journalists that are able to be there either. But it's clear that the protests have not stopped, right? They're not as intense as they were in September, October, November, but they are continuing. And the most recent protests, just in the last several days, in fact, I think this picture was taken yesterday, there's been a rash of what they're referring to as poisonings of schoolgirls. So thousands of young Iranian schoolgirls are complaining that they smell something funny in their schools, and then they are getting sick, nausea, headaches, feelings of numbness, sometimes paralysis, they can't breathe, etc. 2 days ago, the supreme leader said that if, in fact, what was going on was deliberate, that the culprit should face the death penalty. And that's the first time that he has actually admitted that this has been happening. So it's been going on since November. Thousands of young schoolgirls have been impacted by this. It's happened in the majority of Iran's provinces in about 260 different schools. The Interior Minister said the other day that they had, quote unquote, found suspicious samples, but he would not elaborate on what those were. And so the regime is now taking this very seriously because, again, you've got parents and students that are coming out and protesting. The teachers are going on strike in Kurdistan around this. And then finally, the slogans that we are hearing in these protests, which clearly mark this off as a kind of a substantive break with anything we had seen before. So among the chants that people routinely are using, and by the way, of course, Iranians are hearing what people in other parts of Iran are chanting at their protests on social media, and then those can spread, or they're sharing chants, etc. But among the things that we have heard over the last several months, the nation is begging, referring to its economic system, but the supreme leader acts like God. Forget about Syria, think about our condition. The ICRG are traitors. Reza Shah, may your spirit live on. Reza Shah was the Shah's father. And this is not because people want to go back to the monarchy, it's because Reza Shah was well known for having cracked down heavily on the authority of the clerics. So the message that they're saying by saying Reza Shah, may your spirit live on, is we want to crack down on the clerics. They've also been chanting, mullahs must get lost, death to the dictator, death to Khomeini, no more Islamic Republic, independence, freedom, Iranian Republic. So that line has been crossed in Iran. People are willing now to confront what they see as an entrenched authoritarian regime, which appears to realize that repression is probably the only way it's going to be able to stay in power. It's very hard to predict change or to see change coming until suddenly the system cracks wide open. Right? No one thought the Soviet Union was going to collapse, and then one day it was gone. And nobody thought Hosni Mubarak was going to fall from office, and then 17 days later, he was out of power. So there are trends in Iran that are tracking with things that we've seen in other places in the Middle East in protests, which seem to suggest that the tension is really building in Iran. The younger generation is not willing to buckle under to this new regime. And so the likelihood is that this kind of low-level but consistent protest activity across the entire country is likely to consider, unless the regime uses even more levels of deadly force than it has already been willing to do so. So at that point, I'd be happy to take any questions. I think that I was told we had about until 10 of 8 or so, because then we all have to leave the library. Yeah, and is it a microphone situation?
And I do have to say one thing. I believe I forgot to introduce you by your name.
No, it was on the.
Did I say Beth Dougherty?
You did.
All right, it's Dougherty, not Doherty, because we had this discussion.
Yes.
She sat on a plane next to a gentleman from Ireland, and she said, how do you pronounce this? And he said, Dougherty. Yes. So she's going with Dougherty.
A major in the Irish army.
And ready with a question.
He told me that was right.
Can you shed some light on the dams on the rivers that were put in the wrong location that created the drought? Was that for reservoir, for hydroelectric? Was that for recreation? Was it to start an infrastructure in the country for its electricity needs with the internet? And it doesn't seem like it's an impoverished country in a sense. I mean, they have air conditioning and they probably got baseboard heat when they need it. So what was the reason to dam the rivers to create the issue?
Sometimes it's for flood control, sometimes it is for hydroelectric, sometimes it is for irrigation purposes because you're trying to divert water from one place to another. The problem for Iran was just they built too many in too many locations. Right? And some of the water protests actually are because the dams have been put in places as a way to divert water from one area to another. And so then the original area is finding out that it doesn't have enough water anymore, and its water is going someplace else.
So they had a big picture to try to modernize in a clean way with hydroelectric, and the consequences are the diversion of the water to a reservoir here creates an issue for the people who were reliant on it from just its natural flow.
Right, but it's not necessarily always about hydroelectricity. Sometimes it's really about irrigation controlling flooding or trying to move water from one place to another.
So they could build back out to address those problems with pipelines and stuff like that to divert the water to where it's needed.
Potentially, but one of the issues is that so I've seen two separate studies that have been looking at the water issue in Iran, and both of them said the majority of the problem is not climate change, it's not drought, it's man-made, it's mismanagement of their water resources.
Growing pains.
Anybody else? This is the fellow that's been in Iran.
Do you have a sense with the protest movements, is there any funding or support being offered by Israel, the US, or others who would like to see the Iranian government fall?
No. I mean, so with the poisonings, I really don't know what else to call them. They're actually calling them that in Iran, so the poisonings of the schoolgirls. The regime has been saying, or at least some officials in the regime have been saying that hostile media figures are creating this problem for Iran. So they're trying to suggest that the Americans or the Israelis might be behind some of these stories. But then just in the last week or so, they also announced that they had arrested 5 people who are involved with this. The protest movement is too decentralized and too leaderless to be able to have really any connections to the outside. The Israelis are more focused on the nuclear program, and they can cause a lot of trouble that way.
What is your opinion about the end game of the protests? Is it reform, regime change? When you think about it, they've had a history of authoritarian government, so there's no model to go back to. Maybe you could, to be really obscure, go back to Mossadegh. But with it being leaderless, what is the goal other than to voice the protest over a variety of things? So what's your forecast for moving forward in the future?
So I think that you have the same sort of spirit animating the protests in Iran that you saw in a lot of the Arab Spring protests, which is that sense that the time for reform is gone, the regime is illegitimate, and that it has to be removed. And so I think that is what they are pushing for. It's not going to be enough anymore, even if the hardliners are willing to do this, for them to relax social restrictions, for example. We've gone past that point. They might have been able to address that in 2009 if they had taken a different path with the protests. But at this point, once they start chanting death to Khamenei, I mean, not just death to the dictator, but death to Khamenei specifically, I think that's a pretty strong signal that the young generation, and again, that's nearly half the population, want the regime gone. That also, though, typically what happens is the regime is then really going to circle the wagons because they recognize that anybody, like for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the people that belong to the besieged, the paramilitary force, if the regime goes down, so do they. And so, unfortunately, I think that the likelihood is that what the regime is going to react with is more repression, because the lesson that people seem to have learned from the Arab Spring was if you just let people out in the streets, that eventually you're going to be in exile or under arrest. Tunisia and Egypt, Syria and Bahrain took a completely different pathway, right? They met those protests with overwhelming force. But I would note that, in Syria, they tipped the country into a civil war. Bahrain continues to be the lid is on, but underneath of that, it continues to be explosive. The regime has no legitimacy left there. And I think that is where we are at in Iran.
You haven't detected the emergence of any countervailing force, though, that could take place if the regime just dissolves.
Oh, you mean if the regime collapses, what is going to come in its wake?
Thank you.
Yes, I mean that's sort of the open question, and certainly what they thought was going to happen in Egypt is not what happened, not what eventually happened. And I would also, prediction is a dangerous business because it's hard to know one way or the other, especially because it's so difficult to get good information out of Iran, and you have to be very careful. You can't trust the regime's figures; they're always too low. And I always want to take opposition figures with a grain of salt because they are looking to make things look worse. But it is clear that the protest movement right now is qualitatively different than what we saw in 2009.
The slide that you had for the military forces, the regulars as well as the irregular forces. Germany's about the same population as Iran, but Germany's only got about 180,000 army guys. So it seems like they're armed to the teeth. What do you think about that?
So you have to sort of look at it from Tehran's perspective. If you're thinking about, so Iraq invaded in 1980, right? And they had fought a war with the Iraqis between 1974 and 1975. And they have real reason to be worried that they could be invaded. They have had war on both sides, right? Because after the U.S. invasion in 2003 in Iraq, and then the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, so you have significant numbers of Afghan refugees, for example, that have been in Iran for a very long time. They are locked in a major battle with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is a much wealthier country. So if you put, I have it in a different slide deck, but if you look at like per capita GDP spending on the military, Iran cannot compete with everybody else that's in the Middle East. The Saudis spend money like unbelievable, right? And then you have Israel, right? And Israel has nuclear weapons, and the Iranians are convinced that, and with good reason, the Israelis have in fact undertaken a lot of successful covert actions in Iran. They killed nuclear scientists. They were able to disable their centrifuge network at one point. So from the Iranian perspective, I think they would tell you, we live in a bad neighborhood, right? And we're afraid of the Saudis, the Americans, and the Israelis, who are all allied and are all out to get us. So I don't necessarily think that, Germany isn't really surrounded by enemies anymore, right? But the Iranians certainly think that they are.
I don't know, it just seems to me that their military forces are more for internal control than for anything else.
Oh, absolutely. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, that is what they're there for, right? To do the paramilitary stuff abroad, if you're going to try to help Shia elsewhere, and then also to defend the revolutionary regime at home. And that's why the regular military gets so much, they get less money, they get, their equipment is older than the equipment that everybody gets in the Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Revolutionary Guard Corps' intelligence services get more money than the Ministry of National Intelligence in Iran. So, you do have those parallel structures, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and the other things that are affiliated with it, that's where the power lies amongst the security services. I think there was
one more question.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Well, I was just going to, if you could address one of the questions at the end of the book, at the end of the, with the current protests going on, is this the time for the U.S. to push for renewal of the, the nuclear deal?
So, yes, I would say yes, right? Because even at the height of the Cold War, the United States was willing to engage in nuclear diplomacy with the Soviet Union on the grounds that controlling nuclear weapons was the most important security threat that we face. And so, first of all, it was a terrible decision on the part of the United States to step away from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and we are still paying for that now. The Iranians are within a couple of weeks, probably, of breakout point, where if they put on the mad dash, they would probably be able to enrich enough uranium for a nuclear bomb. Now, they don't have a delivery technique for it yet, but they were respecting the terms of the agreement at the time the Americans pulled out. The problem, of course, is now that the agreement is gone, all the other problems are making it difficult to get back to that arrangement. And certainly Iran's crackdown around these protests has not helped. Iran's role in selling drones to the Russians for use in Ukraine has not helped. Iran's leader recently met with Xi Jinping in China, again, to discuss their alliance with Russia. But if they could reach some kind of an agreement around the nuclear program, then as long as they don't have to basically give up the store for that, if you could restore it to what it should have been under the JCPOA, I think that would be a reasonable course of action. I mean, if you start off with the assumption that the most important thing is to prevent the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon, then yes, I think they have to negotiate around that. If you lift sanctions around that, you don't have to lift every sanction on the Iranians. You could just lift the nuclear sanctions, and that would still leave a raft of sanctions. So they're not off the hook if they sign some kind of nuclear deal, but the signs are not promising on that front.
Okay, with that, thank you so much. We have 3 more programs. We have 1 book for sale. Thanks for using the book, by the way, for the question. We have 1 book for sale left for $20, I believe the price is. Thanks again for your presentation. It was terrific.